Hello, my name is Jurgen Willems, and in this presentation I will give an overview of a study that I recently did with Louis Fogg from the American University of Washington, D.C. On voluntary disclosure of organizational fraud in non-profit organizations. So what is actually voluntary disclosure? Let's say there are non-profit organizations that face a crisis. Let's say a board member steals some money and it gets leaked to the press or something, or some employee is misbehaving, let's say on a mission in a third world country, or someone else is, or someone is not following the political procedures, or they're involved in bribing or something. That's of course a crisis situation, and it definitely will turn into a big crisis when external stakeholders learn about this. For example, if donors hear about that the organization that you're supporting is involved in such practices, they will stop donating. Newspapers will start talking about it. Policymakers will maybe develop some new rules for them or retract their support. Also, other partner organizations might decide not to collaborate anymore. So that's when a crisis situation occurs. And now the question is, this organization can actually make the decision to voluntarily disclose this situation. For example, they know that something happened on a mission with an employee or something, and they can decide themselves, we're going to be very open about it, so we're going to voluntarily disclose it, and we're going to tell the world, yes, this is what happened. So we're open about it, and hopefully actually it can create, let's say, a forgiveness process among the stakeholders. They can also signal with it that they're actually trying to do something about it, that it won't happen again anymore. So, and that's what we try to study. Does this act of voluntarily disclosing it, does it actually matter, and to what extent? And there has already been some very interesting studies on it. So there are several studies working with secondary data, for example, looking at annual reports. And they analyze whether in these annual reports something is written about the crisis and whether they're open about it. And then they also check whether this is related to, let's say, less donations or different kind of donations or less support or something. And there's also some experimental research, which is also quite interesting, because the experimental research focuses more on the direct reaction. Let's say a stakeholder, a potential donor, reads about this crisis, but also reads that it's voluntarily disclosed, or reads that it actually comes from the organization itself and not from a newspaper. By doing it in an experimental setting, you can really test this immediate reaction, like what is the first reaction of people? Are they actually immediately forgiving the organization because it was voluntarily disclosed? Are they even more disappointed or something? So that's something that can be analyzed in experiments. There's also some research done where the time dimension is questioned, like what if the organization only discloses it, let's say, like 1 or 2 months or even years after that the event took place? Or what when they really try to, let's say, steal thunder, as they say, they actually give the news before anyone else can give it, just to make sure that they can steer the debate a little bit. And it's in that field, or in this literature stream, that we would like to contribute with this study. So what is actually our hypothesis? It's explicit information about voluntary disclosure of fraud by a non-profit organization is expected to mitigate the overall negative effect of the fraud on stakeholder donations intentions. What does this mean? Actually, if a stakeholder, let's say a donor, receives information that there was a crisis in the organization, let's say 3 board members, they stole money to buy something personal or something. So a stakeholder learns this news, that's the crisis, and we can expect that because of that news, his trust in the organization, his or her willingness to donate to the organization might be reduced. Now the question is, if this information that you get also says something about, the organization is open about it, the organization voluntarily disclosed it, whether this extra piece of information can actually mitigate this negative effect, meaning, like, let's say they would normally lose 50% of the donations, but just the information that it was voluntarily disclosed, would it reduce to only, let's say, a 40% loss of donations? So that's the question we ask ourselves. So we follow actually more the stream of the experiments that happened in this field already. So we really want to test the direct reaction of stakeholders. We will give them vignettes, and in the vignettes these informations are given. And we really ask them immediately after, like, how much would you still donate? What we also try to do is, of course, keep the information as constant as possible. meaning that so we take one crisis situation. Actually, we test two crisis situations in two different experiments, or two different experimental settings. But actually, with this crisis, is there like this extra small effect of voluntary disclosure? So we keep as much constant as possible, which is a prerequisite for experiments, of course. In this experiment, we do not test this time dimension yet, so we assume that people get all this information at once, and we do not vary whether they get it quite early or quite late or something. That's something we do not do yet. And another important setting is, let's say, the challenge to study a crisis. Of course, in some way it has to be hypothetical, or we compare it with a real situation. We could take a real organization and then talk about some crisis that occurred there, but then we cannot control for the fact whether our participants already knew about it. So we took a hypothetical case. That's what we decided, an organization that didn't really exist. So we created this hypothetical setting where we told people, like, let's say you donated about $100 last year. Now this happens, what would you do this year? Hypothetical, we think also helps a little bit for our particular setting, because we don't know if it would be a real organization, whether they already knew that particular organization, and also we don't want to give information about a crisis, a hypothetical crisis for a real organization that might damage their image just for our research purposes. That's not okay for us. So that's the setting. So what did we do? We did actually 3 online experiments. We did the first smaller one where we looked at a high severity crisis, where we really gave a description of 3 board members stealing money, and therefore they left the organization. We tested it again with a low severity crisis, where actually only just one employee used some of the resources for personal gain. And then based on the reviewers' recommendations, we actually tested it again with a much bigger sample. We tested both, so I'll talk about it in a second, just to make sure that we could find potential effects if they were there in reality. So the first 2 experiments were done with Qualtrics panels, and these 2 experiments were also embedded in a larger data collection. And the third one, so where we test both the high and the low severity condition, was done with Mechanical Turk. So what are our variables? The dependent variable is the willingness to donate. So we really asked people, let's say last year you donated $100 for this organization. How much would you donate this year? And they could really give an amount from 0 to whatever dollars. What is our independent variable? We had actually 5 treatment groups. You see group A is the blue one. Let's say it's a first control group, where in that group we only gave the mission of the organization. So our organization was called Earthlove, and we only gave the mission. So when people actually decide based on the mission to give the same amount, then we have something like let's say a default or like a benchmark to start from. That is what normally this organization would get if no crisis would occur from this sample of respondents. And then group B is, let's say, a second control group, where we give the mission of Earthlove plus the overall crisis situation, but no information yet on how it was disclosed. So actually comparing group A with group B gives us an insight in how bad the crisis was. For example, if people are really, really disappointed hearing about the severe crisis, let's say the 3 board members stealing money, then we know actually that is what the negative effect of this crisis. But our research question is, can this negative effect be mitigated? So reduced completely or partially reduced. So that's why we have, let's say, group C, where we have again this mission, we have the overall crisis, and we just mention that the crisis situation was voluntarily disclosed by the organization. So there we can really, by comparing group B and C, we can really see like the negative effect of the crisis. Maybe it's not that bad if people also learn that the organization was open about it. Group D and E actually test the same. So in group D, we just added a placebo. So the situation, it's also the mission of the organization, the overall crisis situation, but that it was disclosed by a newspaper just to test this message of disclosure, whether that has an effect, but this time really by an external partner. And group E then has all the information. Also because that is probably a realistic situation, we really want to compare the different cases that can occur. So the mission of the organization is given in E, the overall crisis, and then that it was disclosed by a newspaper, but also voluntarily. Just by comparing the groups, we can just test a little bit whether there is indeed this extra mitigating effect. And on the map you see, so it was in the United States, every dot is a respondent. This location is approximated based on IP addresses. So these are the results. Actually, the black bars. So there's. Let's first start with the horizontal axis. There are in experiment 3. So I only will report experiment 3 here. You see the 9 situations, which is the base case, which was group A for both settings the same. And then you have 4 low crisis situations, no disclosure, voluntary disclosure, third-party disclosure, and both voluntary and third-party disclosure. And then you have the same with 4 high crisis situations. So that is actually the distribution of the donations that people would give. And the black one is actually people giving again $100. So because we taught them to imagine, we told them to imagine that they gave 100 last year. And we see that actually, let's say in the base case, 60% gives $100 again. Some of them give even more, others give less. And then what we see is that, of course, in the low crisis situation, more people decided to give less. So that is why these 4 bars from in the low crisis category are a bit lower. And of course, in the high crisis category, it's even more lower, just more people decide to give less. So that's a little bit about the distribution, about the decisions that people make from giving again 100, giving more, or giving less. This is actually these are the same results, but looking at the distributions, what we also see is it's again the same 9 groups, but this time on the vertical axis. We see that the distributions change a little bit, so there's always this bulk around 100, so some people stay with this anchor decision actually, but you see that more people move to the left, especially in the high crisis situation. It's also not normal distributed. These are then the confidence intervals, and what we see, and this is also, let's see, our main results can be derived here. Again, we see the base case, the average amount is again about $100. Then you see like 4 groups on the low crisis situation, but between the 4 groups there's not a real significant difference. And we find the same for the high crisis. There is a little bit more variation there, but again, the high crisis, the 4 groups are lower than the other groups, but between the 4 groups there are no real significant differences. So what does this mean actually? That whether people give more or less mainly depends on the crisis situation and doesn't really depend on how it was disclosed. So what is our main implication or our main finding, at least from this experiment and how we conducted it? Voluntary disclosure doesn't really matter, or doesn't really matter a lot, because it's an experiment and we know how much statistical power we have. So you can also read it in the paper. But actually, it could be that it matters, but based on this larger sample size, it would then only matter very marginally. So actually, the main thing is, if a crisis occurs, that will harm the organization, and maybe just very marginally, whether you voluntarily disclose it or not might have an effect. At least we have to frame that a little bit. That's the direct effect. If the organization continues to talk, has a whole recovering strategy, that's something we didn't measure here. That might be more relevant on the long term, but on the short term, voluntary disclosing, at least in this experiment, doesn't really matter. From a theory perspective, what we did, we compared our results with the other experiments and studies that were done, and we realized that actually if we want to really explore this further, it makes probably sense to make a distinction for time, source, and content of disclosure. So in this experiment and in many other experiments, there's not a real test of the time dimension. So probably further studies can really test whether disclosing it quite early in the process or quite late, whether that has an extra effect. The source, so actually in our experiment, the source was us, the researchers, and we just told about voluntary disclosure. Other studies have tested the difference between, let's say, a press release and a newspaper article. But then also the content is varied, because newspaper articles are very often a little bit more rough compared to a press release. And actually we discovered that these are 3 dimensions that actually can be varied, and probably each might have different effects. So that's something to further explore by what we realized based on comparing our results with previous literature. And also by framing it in the literature, we realized that, yeah, indeed, we only look at this immediate effect based on reading the information. So it's all about reputation, and reputation is something that builds up over time. So it might make sense to look at people's reaction and intention to continue to donate or something when more information follows. Maybe also the organizational image or identity plays a role. For some organizations, we are more forgiving than for others. So that are actually some moderators that also might have to be included in further research. So that are, this is the end of the presentation. If there are any further questions or comments, you can always contact us.